Mr. Speaker, the images coming out of northern Gaza have horrified many, as has the news of yet more indiscriminate bombing, and it's had many reaching into humanity's darkest periods for historical comparisons. Now, I don't know which of those is appropriate, but I do know that on each of those occasions we told ourselves this time was different, and yet it never was. Mr. Speaker, does the ministerial team realise that what they do now is what they would have done then? And if they do realise that, do they believe that the conversations they're having are enough? And if they don't, when will they actually act positively to bring about a ceasefire?
The attacks saw more than 4-5 residential blocks razed to the ground. Some reached the hospital, some remain under the rubble. That is the account of Dr. Eid Sabah of Kamal Adwan Hospital in northern Gaza, which he gave to the BBC yesterday. I've noted the Minister's qualified earlier response, but as the UN Special Envoy for the peace process warns that nowhere in Gaza is safe, does the Minister agree with me that the UK should now cease all arms exports to Israel?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently met with the West London Islamic Centre in my constituency of Ealing Southall, and they told me that they are deeply concerned about the plight of severely injured children in Gaza who need urgent medical help. Could the Minister outline what work she is doing to ensure these children get access to the very best medical attention?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this important issue, and also to her constituents and the very many people across the UK who are determined to do what they can. Of course, we've seen that also with the UK public's response to the DEC appeal, matched by this government's £10 million. Now, she asked specifically about young children who have been caught up and who have been injured. The extent of disease and injury is significant and deeply concerning. We've provided significant support, including through UK Med, for their field hospital in Gaza. And last week, my honourable friend announced £1 million to the Egyptian Ministry of Health to support medically evacuated Palestinians from Gaza.
Will Stone. Many residents from Swindon North have contacted me expressing their concerns about Gaza. What steps is the Minister taking to help improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this. We see people up and down the country who are very concerned about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Clearly, we now have extreme levels of food insecurity. We're very concerned about the situation in northern Gaza in particular. We have been very clear, including to all actors in the region, via the Foreign Secretary, the Prime Minister and all of us in the ministerial team, that there must be access to the aid that is so desperately needed in all of Gaza.
Anna Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the devastating Hamas attack on Israel over a year ago, an estimated 42,000 Palestinians have died, including many civilians, and many more families have been repeatedly displaced. Will the Minister or Secretary of State assure me and my constituents that the Government are using the full diplomatic force of the British Government to secure an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and to allow the free flow of humanitarian aid?
Yes, I can. A resolution to this conflict has been a priority since day one of the new government. We are calling for an immediate ceasefire, the release of all hostages still cruelly detained by Hamas, and for much more aid to enter Gaza. The death and destruction in Gaza is intolerable, and we have made that clear at every possible moment.
Laura Kirk-Smith.
Speaker, I declare an interest as a former board member of the Disasters Emergency Committee, but I am delighted to see the British public's generous response to their appeal. I know its member agencies are doing everything in their power to get aid to those who need it, but one of their member agencies, Islamic Relief, told me yesterday about the situation in Jabalia, where people, I quote, are being starved, bombed and shot on site. What conversations has the Minister had with Israeli counterparts to end the indiscriminate attacks on people in Gaza and let in the life-saving aid that the British public are so generously supporting?
I'm grateful to the honourable lady, my honourable friend, for her question, and again I repeat our gratitude to the DEC for their work in ensuring that there has been that emergency appeal for the Middle East. Of course, I should have mentioned earlier it's covering Gaza, but also Lebanon, the broader Middle East as well, because there is that humanitarian need that is so urgent. I can reassure her that on issues of access to aid, the UK government has been ensuring that we've been crystal clear on the need for this, the maintenance of international humanitarian law right across the region, and of course that includes with Israel as well. The Foreign Secretary underlined that indeed at the end of last week.
Dr. Zubair Hamad.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister reassure me that the arms licence ban, export licence ban that we made in September to Israel covers items that we reasonably believe could be used to breach international law in Gaza? And can she further reassure me that the remaining export licences that go to Israel largely do not cover licences going to the IDF or indeed cover military equipment?
OK, we asked our whips. That's fine.
Sorry, we've got one person answering the...
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do want to be very clear, as I think there is some confusion on this point, which is so important. Mr. Speaker, following the 2nd of September suspension, there are currently no extant UK export licences. I will repeat that again. No extant export licences for items to Israel we assess might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law. There's only one exception, which is for F-35 components, and the Foreign Secretary has explained this to the House. My honourable friend is absolutely right to say that most licences for exports to Israel are absolutely not for the IDF, and I'm pleased to be able to put that on the record in the House. Thank you.
Neil O'Brien.
The footage of the children caught up in the fighting in Gaza is absolutely horrendous, and so is the footage of those who are held hostage still. Now, firstly, what is the Minister doing to ensure the protection of aid workers in Gaza and Lebanon? And secondly, given that she's just told us that our efforts to get more aid in are not working, what are her next ideas? Where are we going to go from here? Because clearly it's not working.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for his question, and we have indeed seen some extremely disturbing scenes. Of course, it's very important that we ensure that there is verified information in the fog of such a horrendous war, but I know that we will all have seen those scenes and be disturbed by them. Now, the UK government is determined to do all that we can to ensure that aid is accessing those who need it. So we are using every opportunity that involves working with UN agencies in detail. I've had many meetings with them. Of course, he will know that we've also resumed support for UNRWA. We've been in close contact with them, the World Food Programme, all others working on this, but also bilaterally with all of our partners who are working in the region, with a number of different countries working with us to try and ensure there is that access to aid that's so desperately needed.
Catherine Foulkes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for all she has done so far on this issue. But my constituents, including Damon and Annie, are extremely concerned that every day things are only getting worse, with the UN saying that all essential supplies for survival are running out, and given the abject conditions in North Gaza, the fact that humanitarian access is nearly non-existent is unconscionable. A year on from the conflict starting, we are still debating restrictions on the flow of aid by Israeli authorities. What more can she do to ensure the people dying of hunger, thirst and lack of medical care get the attention they need?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can only underline that the new UK government is doing all that we can to get aid in as quickly as possible, supporting trusted partners on the ground to deliver life-saving humanitarian aid. As was already mentioned during this debate, we have agreed to match up to £10 million of public donations to the Disasters Emergency Committee's Middle East Humanitarian Appeal. That is going to be providing life-saving aid, including medical supplies, shelter and clean water to people in need. That's on top of the support we released for UNRWA. But of course that aid then needs to get to the people who are desperately in need of it. And I would refer to the response I just made to a previous question on this point. We're using every avenue to advance that cause.
Malthouse.
Mr. Speaker, the images coming out of northern Gaza have horrified many, as has the news of yet more indiscriminate bombing. And it's had many reaching into humanity's darkest periods for historical comparisons. Now, I don't know which of those is appropriate, but I do know that on each of those occasions we told ourselves this time was different, and yet it never was. Mr. Speaker, does the ministerial team realise that what they do now is what they would have done then? And if they do realise that, do they believe that the conversations they're having are enough? And if they don't, when will they actually act positively to bring about a ceasefire?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Member for his question. However, surely he must recognise that from the first day of this new government coming in to position, we have sought to do all we can to advance that cause of a ceasefire. And on the issue of international humanitarian law, which he rightly stated so clearly as being imperative, we have been consistently clear as a new government. Israel must comply with international humanitarian law. It must allow unfettered aid access. Our message is clear. Israel could and must do more to ensure that aid reaches civilians in Gaza, and we have upheld our legal requirements around that, as he will have seen in relation to the decisions taken around arms export licences.
Brendan O'Hara.
Last month, the Minister of State told this chamber, "We could not be clearer. Intentionally directing attacks on civilian objects is a war crime. Those attacks threaten civilian access to power, heating, water supply, impacting safety and livelihood of millions of Ukrainians." And she was absolutely right. But why is it that this government can't immediately call out Putin's war crimes the moment they happen, but they seem utterly incapable of doing that when the perpetrator is Netanyahu and when the victims are Palestinians?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I do regret the tone of the honourable member's question. He surely can recognise the prioritisation from this new government to do all that we can to secure the ceasefire that is required. Repeated messages that have been conveyed from this government, not just messages, action, time and time again, making sure we play our part. That has been recognised internationally. The changes around UNRWA that we have made, for example, the commitment to the ICC and ICJ, and again making sure that we held to our legal requirements around arms exports. That is a government that is committed to international humanitarian law, Mr Speaker.
Bob Blackman.
Speaker, intercepted communications demonstrate that Hamas are struggling to find room in their warehouses for the aid that is arriving. So what action is the Minister going to take to make sure that UNRWA actually get that aid to the people that need it, desperately need it, we accept, when Hamas are preventing it from reaching the Palestinian population?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Government is clear that UNRWA plays a vital role in saving lives in Gaza and providing much-needed food and basic services and supporting stability in the West Bank and wider region. Wherever there are allegations or reports that there may have been instances of activity that are unacceptable, for example, those that were covered by the Colonna report, we have stated very clearly to UNRWA they must be investigated. They did do that with the Colonna report, and indeed the UK Government has supported the implementation of the findings of that report, and we continue to discuss that in detail with UNRWA so that they can indeed operate in the manner that they are mandated to do by international law.
Adnan Hussain.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Whilst I appreciate the comments made in respect of aid, does the Minister condemn the ethnic cleansing and annexation of northern Gaza under the General's plan, where aid is not being allowed to go into northern Gaza? And if so, what action is being taken against it to demonstrate the UK's strongest objection?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The UK Government is extremely concerned by the situation in northern Gaza. This morning I was discussing this with humanitarians. I have been just about every single day. We really see a deterioration in people's circumstances there in terms of health access to aid. And as I said at the beginning of my statement, the fact that we've seen the lowest amount of aid, or will likely see it this month since the start of the conflict, is unacceptable. We are deeply concerned about the fact that now we've seen many people who have been displaced not just once, twice or three times, but indeed up to 9 times. We will continue to argue for the need for humanitarian access to Gaza. Thank you.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Further to the answer the Minister gave a few moments ago on UNRWA supplies were found in the Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar's underground hideout. As my honourable friend said, the Hamas terrorists are struggling to find warehouse space to store all the misappropriated aid. So when will the government review their commitment to funding UNRWA and actually take action to stop the misappropriation of this aid?
Mr Speaker, I would refer the honourable member to my previous response on this. The UK Government takes any such allegations very seriously. Of course, we have ensured that these are taken up with UNRWA, and indeed with the Kelowna report we saw there a thorough investigation into allegations that have been made, some of which were proven. UNRWA has been taking action in order to deal with them. It really is important that neutrality is held to, and we as the UK have played our part by ensuring that they have the funding required to implement those recommendations.
Senator Foreign Secretary Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the removal of the international terrorist Yahya Sanwar and the possibility of an amnesty for those who now release the 97 remaining hostages, what pressure is the government bringing to bear to urge Hamas to lay down their arms and release hostages, both of which are necessary for full, unfettered access for humanitarian relief in Gaza?
Well, I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Member, of course, for raising this incredibly important issue, and the suffering of particularly the family and friends of the hostages is indescribable. The Foreign Secretary has met with them, particularly those who have UK links, so has the Prime Minister, and repeatedly they have ensured that the release of hostages must be prioritised. They have articulated that message time and time again, will continue to do so until the hostages are indeed able to return home, as they must be able to do.
Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Coexistence, Mr. Speaker, is inescapable, and a two-state solution is one day inevitable, as both Israelis and Palestinians are here to say. Just as the First Intifada ushered in the historic breakthrough at Oslo, so too Britain, with its deep regional connections, UN responsibilities and brilliant diplomatic service, has a key role in lifting people's eyes to a very different future. What discussions is the government having on this, building on the significant efforts started under the last government?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We don't always agree across the dispatch box, but I strongly agree with the Right Honourable Member's characterisation of the need for ultimately a two-state solution as the only way of delivering the peace and security that the people of Israel and Palestine also deserve. That's a long-term commitment of this government to make sure that we play our part in exercising leadership towards that two-state solution. But of course, as he would expect, we need to show what that can deliver. There's a huge amount of work ongoing around reconstruction. I've discussed this, for example, in detail with the World Bank, the survey that they've been conducting around need that will be required, making sure that's fully coordinated so that we can see that secure future for those who are in Gaza at the moment. Thank you.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Colin Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The attacks saw more than 5 residential blocks razed to the ground. Some reached the hospital, some remain under the rubble. That is the account of Dr. Eid Sabah of Kamal Adwan Hospital in northern Gaza, which he gave to the BBC yesterday. I've noted the Minister's qualified earlier response, but as the UN Special Envoy for the peace process warns that nowhere in Gaza is safe, does the Minister agree with me that the UK should now cease all arms exports to Israel?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, with all due respect, particularly to my county colleague, would urge him to look again at what I stated, which stipulated very clearly the legal grounds for that decision around arms exports, but also the clarity around the fact that the restrictions that have been placed on arms due to that legal regime, which the UK government was determined to fulfil, are because the other licences are not going to be used in the manner that some would suggest. You know, we're very clear about the need to fulfil our international responsibilities in that regard. And just, if I may, very briefly, Mr. Speaker, he talked about the role of healthcare workers within Gaza, and we would seek to pay tribute to all of those who have been delivering healthcare, many of them British citizens, UK Med, which the UK government has supported. We pay tribute to them.
Davis.
Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for the question. The Foreign Office works closely with our allies and partners to counter Iran's support for proscribed groups. They clearly include Hamas, as many members have mentioned already, Lebanese Hezbollah and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We currently have over 400 sanctions in place on Iran in response to their human rights violations, nuclear escalation and indeed terrorism. We also continue to hold Iran publicly accountable for their direct support as my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, did in his intervention at the Security Council on the 25th of September.
Iran's malign activity and support for its proxies is destabilising the Middle East. Does the Minister agree with me this must end? And would he say a little bit more about what steps he's taking?
Thank you. I do agree. In all of our efforts in the region, we are clear Hamas and the other Iranian proxies that are doing so much to destabilise the region must stop, and we're working with our allies to that effect, including reviewing new measures that we can take.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For years, the Foreign Secretary and the Labour Party has promised to prescribe the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the chief sponsor of global terrorism. Is the government going to take action to tackle terrorism and extremism in the UK, or is the government going to break yet another promise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I understand the question from the former Home Secretary, she's saying when she was the Home Secretary, she did not prescribe the IRGC. She thinks we should now, within 100 days. I say to my honourable friends, we will take the necessary action in the UK to prevent the IRGC from taking action on these streets, but we do not comment, as she knows well, on whether or not an organisation is under consideration for prescription in the normal way.